do frogs matter? Some people really love them, other people don't care or notice them at all. But they are a sentinel species. They are one of the first animals to react when there are chemical problems in the environment and disease problems. And they're a gentle little animal. And basically the bottom line is humans have no right to wipe them out, or any other species for that matter. So we do need to have frogs as part of our environment. And they're very good for bug control. You don't need insecticides if you've got frogs in your yard. They will eat up the bugs for you. So they are important, and they're important for other species in the food chain as well. If frogs aren't there, then species above them in the food chain have to find something else to eat, which causes other declines. So Cairns used to have about 26 species of frogs. You used to see them everywhere. Same thing with cane toads. You could go to any flooded curbside anywhere in Cairns and find thousands of cane toad tadpoles. Not anymore, not for a long time. But our decline wasn't one of those things that gradually picked up pace and bit by bit frogs simply disappeared from the local environment. This decline started very, very suddenly, the wet season of 1997. And based on a meeting I had about a year ago with a toxicologist from Europe who helped us piece together what's been going on, it is quite likely that the decline started suddenly when a new product hit the market that frogs couldn't handle. And all of a sudden their immune systems weren't working anymore, and they started to come up with all kinds of problems. Soil diseases, protozoal problems, parasites, even cancer. So this was a very sudden start to this decline, and it has been quite severe ever since. Now, some things that do happen to frogs that have nothing to do with chemicals, hit by cars, at the start of every breeding season in the summer, we get a whole bunch hit by cars. Sometimes they're mistaken for cane toads and killed off because there are ground species of frogs here. But we don't see very many injured frogs anymore. They're not getting in the way of anybody because there aren't enough of them around to get in people's way. So we don't see very many injuries anymore. But there are other things that are more insidious about what's happening to them. For example, there's simply not enough food left in the environment to feed frogs. Our insecticides and pesticides are basically killing off the food supply. We're cutting down all the big trees in Cairns, which is what insects are feeding on. The habitat is contaminated by not only council, but many other users are using chemicals, including people that participate in re-veg projects. They use herbicides in their re-veg plots to keep the weeds down around their trees that they're growing. Real estates are also very heavy users of chemicals, unfortunately. And of course, with all the cats and dogs that we have in Cairns, a lot of them are not properly wormed, and even those that are wormed are still spreading certain types of parasites that do get into frogs and kill them. A lot of the chemicals that are used by households and council are ending up in the drains and waterways, and these are areas that frogs desperately need to breed in. But as soon as they breed in a water body that's been contaminated by any amount of runoff, that's it. Their tadpoles are malformed when we pick them up. We don't even bother to do much tadpole rescue anymore because everything we rescue is deformed. And that's just outrageous. That's why the decline has gotten so bad. So the ghost in the machine, what we feel very strongly fits the pattern of frog decline is what is called sublethal doses of chemicals, where it isn't enough chemical to kill the animal, but it is enough chemical to disable its immune system, and then everything else in the environment invades that animal and kills it off. So when we get, particularly the white-lipped tree frog, there's something about the genetics of the white-lipped tree frog that when they come in the door to us as a rescue group, they've got 3 to 5 disease problems in the same animal. They've got cancer. All the cancer cases have been in the white-lipped tree frog so far. They've got multiple parasite infestations. They've got protozoal problems. These animals are literally a sponge for every pathogen out there in the environment because their immune system is not functioning. Okay, well, a few happy snaps, or as some people, sort of call them, the horror film, still life sort of thing. Parasites are one of the big problems that the frogs have. Now, they never had these parasite problems at the levels we're seeing in them prior to 1996. That's only since then that all of a sudden they're getting these massive concurrent infestations of parasites. These photos are of spirometra, which comes out of cats. That is the definitive animal that produces spirometra eggs. But we're not seeing that much in the way of spirometra anymore because of our dry 3 years that we've had. Spirometra needs a heavy wet to reproduce. So when we're in drought, we don't see that much spirometra. But we are getting a lot of other problems that are parasitic, such as other worms that we're trying to get identified in the animals. Worms that aren't supposed to be there at all in the frogs. And also very heavy infestations of protozoa. So that's been very common, especially since Cyclone Yasi in February 21. A lot of mosquito diseases we have had cultured by labs, and they're basically giving us a list of all the opportunistic pathogens. These are all invading frogs. So obviously the immune system isn't working. The frog on the top left corner is from Townsville, so it's not just Cairns that has these problems. We're based in Cairns, so most of the animals come from Cairns, but we receive animals from Townsville to the tip of the Cape, and they basically all have the same suite of problems. The frog on the top right, that's a bacterial ulcer that has gone systemic. So these frogs can have dozens of ulcers on the body. They're usually on the underside where people don't necessarily notice them. The frog on the top left also has an additional problem. If you look at the little lump on the side of the body there, the frog's right-hand side of the body, there's a little lump there on that animal. That is most likely a neoplasia, but we did not have the money when that frog came in to get that operated on or to send it to a lab for pathology. Basically, we're talking $200 and up to get something identified by the lab. So that's one of the neoplasias that we've never had identified so far. Now, malformations. This is the second really bad wave that's involved in the local decline. Ever since January 2003, when the drought broke that we had from 2000 to 2003, as soon as that drought broke, we started to pick up malformed animals. And the malformations weren't just from Cairns, we were getting calls from all over Queensland at the same time. So it wasn't your typical disease problem that radiates out from a ground zero source. This was something where, scattered all over the place, we started getting calls from people to say that they were picking up animals with multiple arms and that sort of thing. So a lot of these animals have come from Cairns. The bottom two were Centenary Park. City View Estate was the one, the tadpole on the right. The one on the top came from Mount Carbine. And basically when this problem occurs, it has affected the genetics in the offspring. So the animal looks fine up until it reaches a certain stage of development where that malfunction has gone into its genes. That gene kicks in, all of a sudden there's a change. So the animal up at the top is one of the Cyclorana deep burrowing frog species. And we had that group as a batch of tadpoles. And as soon as each individual hit 2 months of age, the malformations kicked in. So within a week, it lost all the rigidity in its skeleton. So it immediately went into scoliosis, and the legs simply didn't work. You can see the legs were rubberized and going every which direction. And they were perfectly fine until they hit that 2-month mark. So these are malformations that do appear to be genetically connected, and this is what the toxicologist from Europe was talking about. Up in Europe, they take chemical research a lot more seriously than they do in this country. They do hardly anything with toxicology in this country. And their work up there in Europe has showed that it isn't the offspring that necessarily has a malfunction, it's the parents. The parents are picking up the chemical contamination, it is changing the parents' DNA, and then when they reproduce, the offspring are malformed because they've got bad genes going into the offspring to start with. So, one more item to point out there, I mean obviously the cane toad is also affected. We've had a few toads come in that have a third arm growing out of the chest. But that tadpole at the top came from Howell Road up at Youngaborough, which feeds into Lake Tinaroo. That batch of tadpoles was the most malformed. I call them Frankenstein's offspring. There was nothing right about any of those tadpoles. Even their skin cells were mutated. So that batch was really checked out thoroughly by the Registry of Wildlife Pathology in Sydney. So even the skin was mutated. The limbs, you can see there's no right arm. The left arm is a mere stump. The right leg is also a malformed stump. The left leg is undersized and points the wrong direction. I mean, this poor batch was hideous. And that's from chemicals that are being used at Youngaburn, which most people would think is a pretty, you know, cleanish, sort of pretty suburb, trees and farms and all that, but what the farmers are using is really, really bad stuff. Okay, so several slides here having to do with cancer. Cairns has the dubious distinction of being the frog cancer capital of Australia. Our cancer rates are so bad that even on a worldwide scale, we are one of the worst places for amphibian cancer in the world. So one of the first cancers that we discovered back in 1999, and we have had about 12 cases of this particular cancer turned into us. There are other cases in the area that haven't been turned into us, but this is squamous cell carcinoma, and always in the white-lipped tree frog, so there's some connection to its genes with this cancer. Cancer number 2, we were told by a researcher that was working on this problem that this was the world's first verified case of osteosarcoma in a frog. Now, we've only had one of this type of tumor turned into us, but if you have a look at the cane toad up the top, that came from the Kimberley area where they've got the toad busting program in progress, but because of the logistics of trying to get those animals to a lab, they couldn't bring them back to Darwin. They weren't allowed to send them over the border to scientists in WA. So the animals from anywhere in Kimberley were never looked at scientifically. But we were told we could use this photo. But you look at the tumor type, and it looks very, very similar to our osteosarcoma tree. These cancers are interesting. The squamous cell cases are almost always from the lower northern beaches of Cairns, almost always, with rare exceptions. We have one from Gordon Vale and one from White Rock. These tumors are always from the suburbs at the upper northern beaches. So Kawara, Palm Cove, Clifton, that's where we get these cases from. Some of them have come from other areas, though. We had one from Mundu, which is south of Innisfail. We had one from Port Douglas. So these are, again, there's something also that might be involved with contact transmission, and we've been told that these cancers are most likely caused by viruses, herpes viruses in particular. So that might explain why they're concentrated in certain areas. Okay, so let's talk about the process. If you have manufactured a chemical and you want to be able to sell that chemical in Australia, how do you get that done? Well, it's pretty damn easy. It's almost a rubber stamp process. There is a manual called the MORAG manual that goes over a nice thick little thing that talks about procedures that the manufacturers are supposed to adhere to. And there is a chemical assessment branch which is part of Environment Australia. And what they do basically is tell the manufacturer to do all your testing in-house. And once they've done that, they submit their paperwork results to the Australian government. The people at the chemical assessment branch read through the paperwork and say, well, I think you're telling the truth. This looks pretty good. And they approve it and send it on to the APVMA, who adds it to their list. And their list of chemicals that are approved for sale in Australia is now around 70,000 chemicals are approved for use in this country. None of them have been tested on amphibians. Hardly any of them have been tested on marine life in general. There's only a couple foreign fish species that are included in the MORAG manual, and that's it. So the impacts that might occur with any Australian species are not covered. It's all foreign species that are involved in the testing. And of course, once they are approved for sale in Australia, then it's a one-way revolving door. Other countries can do the work to ban these chemicals, not the Australian government. They hardly ban anything. So what happens with stuff that is banned overseas is they then send all their stock to Australia, where it can be sold here, because we're one of the few countries that continues to sell the stuff, even after places like Europe or the United States ban things. So, very, very bad. And then the water quality stuff, the testing that is done for the barrier reef is voluntary. There's no mandatory requirements to test any of these chemicals. I mean, how could you test 70,000 chemicals anyway that are used in Queensland? So what is picked up by the water quality testing that is done is just a handful of chemicals, and it is voluntary. Okay, so one of the things that I found whenever I try to talk about toxicology in wildlife, and it's not just frogs, it's flying foxes, it's cockatoos, it's any of the multitudes of wildlife that are all in decline in this country. We have extraordinary rates of wildlife decline in this country, and toxicology is not being pursued for the vast majority of it. When I try to talk to academics or government people about doing toxicology, the usual response is, you don't have any proof. Well, that's why we want to do the toxicology, because the proof is in the animals, and somebody has to pay for it. It's very expensive, and the government doesn't want to pay for toxicology work, so everybody keeps saying, well, there's no proof. Well, if you won't do the toxicology, then no, you don't have any proof. So it's very hard to get about proof that would be convincing. We're basically trying to see if we can raise some of the money to do our own toxicology work. And in reality, the only way that we're going to get honest answers is if we do the work ourselves. And for people who might be skeptical about that, just look at the situation from Gladstone with all the dredging problems they had there, and the incredibly diseased animals that the fishermen were pulling in. I mean, mud crabs with the hard shell eaten off the body. I mean, come on. The government said, oh, well, we didn't find much. It was inconclusive. It's always inconclusive when they do this work. They never seem to come to any specific conclusions about the work that they do. It's always an inconclusive result. So what the fishermen did was raise their own money. They hired Dr. Matt Landhaus to do their work for them, and Matt Landhaus came out with a very different conclusion than what biosecurity did. So if you want to get honest work done yourself, you have to basically pay for it yourself. So that's what we would like to do at some point. Now, where we sort of get into, there's sort of a diverging route here. If Andre had been here tonight, he would have been talking very specifically about glyphosate, which is really what this evening is about. But we are very hot and heavy about a different chemical group that we think is involved in frog decline, and that's the neonicotinoids. So sometime tonight, have a read of the poster over there. We are working on a comprehensive fact sheet at the moment, which we hope will be ready in September. It'll be a 4-page item. But the thing that bothers us is that these are all systemic chemicals, including glyphosate, which is what Roundup is based on. Systemic chemicals are really nasty because you can spray or use the chemical on any part of the plant, and the whole plant will absorb it. So when that plant matures and produces pollen or nectar or pollen fruit, those items will also have the chemical in it. So a wide range of wildlife could be affected by it. So wildlife feeding on the roots, for example, cicadas, could be affected. Anything that feeds on the leaves of that plant will be affected. So a lot of the insects that frogs and other animals need to depend on could be contaminated when they've eaten a contaminated plant. Anything that, pollen and nectar are taken by many different animals, including bees and flying foxes. So these animals could be also affected. The fact that flying foxes have suddenly started to transmit viruses that they never had prior to 1994 is very suspicious that a chemical is involved in that, and nobody's doing any research on that as to whether the whole problem with bats has been caused because of chemical contamination. So we also have a poster having to do with that as well, because there's two things I think that are driving the flying fox problem. They're moving into the towns because they don't get sprayed when they're in the towns. So they're abandoning one camp after another out in the rural areas, but also they are attracting parasites and viruses, and that's also most likely linked to chemicals. So the systemic stuff is really dangerous. The neonics are a systemic group, and also the glyphosate is another systemic group. So our public enemy number one is the neonicotinoid group. This is the group that is responsible for bee die-offs in the north, especially in the northern hemisphere, but also in the southern hemisphere as well. It's not very well publicized down here, but also we don't have the varroa mite like they do in the northern hemisphere, so our decline is a lot more subtle than what they're getting in the northern hemisphere. But this is a very nasty group of chemicals, and in Australia there are approximately approximately 400 products on the market that use neonicotinoids. There's a couple chemicals in particular that we want to alert people to. One of them is called imidacloprid, and the cane farmers have now started using imidacloprid, and JCU has actually done water quality testing up and down the Queensland coast, and they have picked up imidacloprid in every single location they've done water quality testing. So we know that imidacloprid is definitely going out to the reef. And what it's doing to coral, we don't know because nobody has tested it. But we know it's a problem. There are 227 products in Australia that have imidacloprid in them. Another one that's also used, which we think is probably involved in the malformations that we started to see in 2003, and that's a chemical called fipronil. Now you might have heard of fipronil lately because Wet Tropics is having to use fipronil against the yellow crazy ants at Edmonton and Kuranda. It is definitely a marine pollutant, so whatever ants they manage to wipe out, I mean the wildlife, marine wildlife there is going to be wiped out either way, either by the crazy ants or the fipronil.
Is that the one that they're aerial dropping around Elm?
I think what they're using an endocrine disruptor for the aerial drops, and the fipronil, they're trying not to use it along the creek lines, but they might be dropping it, but not near the creek lines. They're trying to drop that away from the creek lines. But they're also using an endocrine disruptor, methylprene, I'm not sure, might be the one that they're using. So even the endocrine disruptor is bad for frogs also. But when they're basically the yellow crazy ants have wiped out all living things except the plants themselves. So they sort of feel that it's not a big deal to use the chemical because there's no wildlife there left to be killed by the chemical. The problem is, though, with the wet season, you're going to get some of that runoff into the local creek lines, which is going to get carried further down the system. It's a bad problem. There's no friendly solutions to getting rid of yellow crazy ants, unfortunately. So we're basically telling people that since the Australian government refuses to ban the neonicotinoids, that people basically need to boycott them themselves and use other products for your cats and dogs. So let's look at just some of the huge list of products that are used, and they're not just. It's not just a farming chemical. In fact, it wasn't originally a farming chemical anyway, but it has certainly migrated into farms now that the cane farmers have decided that chlorpyrifos is no longer killing the cane beetle, now they're using imidacloprid, which is really bad news. Dog and cat owners will be familiar with a lot of the products on this list, Frontline particularly, Advocate, Advantage, all these things have neonics in them. The dermaticides are really bad poop. Those chemicals have 7- and 8-year residuals to them. So you use it on your house in the year 2000 and 2007, it's still killing termites. And all that stuff that you use on your foundation is getting carried by the runoff into the local areas. So I think that the malformations in particular, based on where the original specimens came from, was not a farming problem. It is a chemical used around homes that is causing those malformations. In the garden, Confidor, well that's what the cane farmers are using. The trade name is Confidor, what they're using. So it's used on a lot of things. It's also referred to as a lawn pesticide. And there have been studies in the United States on lawn pesticides which show that they are causing cancer in cats and dogs. So it is a very dangerous group. It was only invented in 1991 in Japan. It hit the Australian market in 1996. And immediately after that first wet season, after 1996, when that chemical hit the local market, that's when the local frogs started to die. So,
is that the one that they banned in Europe?
Yes, they're banned temporarily in Europe. They banned it for 2 years to give the scientific community more time to do some more studies. The problem with the European ban is that actually it will be expiring soon, but because the neonics have a 3.5-year residual in the soil, if they come up at the end of the 2 years and say, well, we haven't seen any bee declines in the 2 years, so we're just going to put it back on the market again, that's not a long enough time to actually ban the chemical and see if it's having that much impact on the babies. They really need to ban it for more than 3.5 years. So that's going to be the big battle up in Europe, is can they extend that ban for another couple of years because otherwise the scientists will not be able to prove that it's involved in bee colony. So yes, Europe has banned it for 2 years. Public enemy number 2. A lot of people don't realize that choppers are still used, including in the inlet area of Gordonvale and many other places up here, to spray chemicals, whether they're herbicides, insecticides, whatever the chemicals are. Farmers are still using choppers, and this stuff drifts 10 kilometers away. We've heard that there are farmers in Toba that spray it, there are farmers at Beatrice and Bengali that spray it, not that far from the Bengali organic dairy. This is something that really is outrageous. They actually had a human cleft palate cluster in Coffs Harbour in 1984. And that's when they figured out how far chemicals drift when they're aerially sprayed, because they were able to research that cleft palate cluster and found out that it was the banana farmers nearby Coffs Harbour that were spraying antifungal chemicals on the bananas, which happens up there every single month, that was actually drifting into Coffs Harbour and making these women produce cleft palate babies. Did the New South Wales government decide to ban aerial spraying after that? No! They spent money setting up clinics to help provide support to people that continue to have cleft palate issues.
Jobs. Wonderful.
So aerial spraying is still used up here. I have spoken to residents in some areas, particularly Bengali, where residents have been made sick by aerial spraying. They have complained to every agency possible, and every single agency is slamming the door in their face.
What are they spraying near Mungali? What crop are they spraying?
It's the cattle farmers that are spraying herbicides, but we don't know which herbicide. It kills trees though. They've killed trees on their properties with the herbicide spraying.
Okay.
And it lasts for a long time. I mean, there are actually places where residents have taken photographs of vegetation along the banks of the Beatrice River, and you can see stands of dead trees that, basically didn't grow back. So it's not good. We are far heavier chemical users than the public realizes. Okay, so dealing with weeds. I mean, one of the arguments our group has been trying to stress, we even have bumper stickers we produce that we've been trying to sell that they haven't taken off, is to basically don't use herbicide on your weeds, change the soil pH. You don't need to use herbicide if you control your soil pH and make it more of an alkaline pH. Weeds don't like that. And soil diseases also don't like alkaline pH. So we've got people, including myself, who has ended up in the hospital because of soil disease infections. It's never publicized up here, even though there are lots of people ending up at the base with soil infections. That if you were to use pH treatments instead, dolomite or ag lime, to adjust your soil pH, you would not have weeds to get rid of, and you would not have soil diseases to worry about either. But you never hear anybody talk about that stuff up here. So we basically do recommend ag lime or dolomite instead of herbicide. Okay, so we're almost through these slides now. So basically, the bottom line is that chemicals really have to start being looked at as only a last resort, not a first resort. And they don't fix everything, and you don't want them to fix everything. So look at your garden soil health, not at chemical band-aids. And consider your own health. It's not just the decline of wildlife that is an issue. People are getting chronic diseases left, right, and center. Our cancer rates are skyrocketing. There's got to be a reason for that. And chemicals would have to be involved in that. If you do want to know more about the subject, because this is hard, this is a drop of water in a bucket, basically, but there are plenty of sites on the internet to get information. Also, I brought a handout with me which covers some info that was not in this presentation. This is really just a chopped up version of the full talk that I did at the gardens a while back. So there's plenty of information available if you want to know more. And these websites are also listed in the handout. And this is what we really would like our frogs to look like. You know, we don't want them to be debilitated like they were earlier in this presentation. You know, we want them to be healthy and happy and doing what they do best. And of course, for our stuff, you know, any frog that you see out in the open during the day, it doesn't matter what it looks like, there's something wrong with it. That's the first thing that changes in the behavior when they're ill. So to give us a ring, so that we can hopefully rescue it and recover it. We brought a donation box in case people want to put donations in. Obviously, we're a poor group, and we basically have to keep money in the bank because we keep spending it on rent and car and bills and all that. We do have a raffle going at the moment as well. There's some raffle tickets for sale if anybody wants them. They're $2 each. We're going to draw them at the Botanic Gardens Festival in 4 weeks' time, 3 weeks' time. If you've got any other questions, come and see me privately, so at least we can move on to Jeremy's talk, and I'll hang around for a bit. So thank you.
Thank you.